Listen, I've been meaning to share this with you, and I'm about to do it for some time now. I've had this article actually on in hand for a couple of weeks. Let me give you the preamble. Coming up on October 18th, this is the 6th, so in 12 days on public broadcasting on PBS and also online. There is going to be a special put together by Frontline and the Associated Press, and it's part of an ongoing investigation by these two organizations about Michael Flynn. And the documentary that will be shown on PBS on October 18th is entitled Michael Flynn's Holy War. Now, I haven't seen the any advances on this particular video presentation, this documentary, but I do have in front of me a piece about it written for the Associated Press by Michelle Smith. And rather than my stumble around trying to explain to you what this article says, I'm just going to read it to you, all right? Just flat out share with you what Michelle Smith has written. So kick back. I hope you have your bowl of popcorn, and let us begin. It starts in Batavia, New York. That's the dateline on this article. The crowd swayed on its feet, arms pumping, the beat of twisted sisters, "We're not going to take it," thumping in their chests. The people under the revival tent hooted as Michael Flynn strode across the stage, bopping and laughing, singing the refrain into his microphone, and encouraging the audience to sing along to the transgressive rock anthem. "We'll fight the power that be just. Don't pick our destiny, 'cause you don't know us. You don't belong." The MC introduced him as America's General. But to those in the audience, Flynn is far more than that. He's a martyr, a hero, a leader, a patriot, a warrior. Yeah, he's all that, right? Okay, did I lose my place? I think I did. Okay, here I am. Back to it. The retired Lieutenant General, former National Security Advisor, one-time anti-terrorism fighter, is now focused on his next task, and that is building a movement centered on Christian nationalist ideas where Christianity is at the center of American life and institutions. Flynn brought his fight, a struggle he calls both spiritual and political, last month to a church in Batavia, New York, where thousands of people paid anywhere from a few dollars to up to $500 to hear and absorb his message that the United States is facing an existential threat and that to save the nation, his supporters must act. Flynn is 63 years old, and he has used public appearances to energize voters, along with political endorsements to build alliances and a network of nonprofit groups, one of which has projected spending $50 million, to advance this movement. This is according to an investigation by the Associated Press and the PBS series Frontline. He has drawn together election deniers, mask and vaccine opponents, insurrectionists, Proud Boys, and elected officials and leaders in state and local Republican parties. Along the way, the AP and Frontline documented, Flynn and his companies have earned hundreds of thousands of dollars for his efforts. The story I'm about to share with you is part of an ongoing investigation from the Associated Press and Frontline that includes the upcoming documentary entitled Michael Flynn's Holy War, which will premiere October 18th on PBS and online. The AP and the Frontline producers spoke with more than 60 people, including Flynn's family, friends, opponents, and current and former colleagues. The news organizations also reviewed campaign finance records, corporate and charity filings, social media posts, and similar open source information, and attended several public events where Flynn appeared. Reporters examined dozens of Flynn's speeches, interviews, and public appearances. Flynn himself sat down for a rare on-camera interview with what he calls the mainstream media. Flynn said as the interview got underway, quote, "I don't even know why I'm talking to you, honestly," end quote. Throughout 2021 and 2022, Flynn made more than 60 in-person speeches in 24 states, according to a count by the AP and Frontline. When he speaks, the former top advisor to then-President Donald Trump spreads baseless conspiracy theories, stoking fear and fueling anger and division and grievance. Ruth Ben-Gott, an historian and expert on authoritarianism and fascism, who wrote the book Strongmen, Mussolini to the President, says Flynn is, quote, "one of the most dangerous individuals in America today." She goes on to say, quote, "He is spearheading the attack on our democracy, which is coming from many quarters, and he is affiliated with many of these sectors, from the military to Christian nationalism to election denial to extremist groups. All of this comes together to present a very live threat, and he's at the center," end quote. Flynn has, with mixed success, supported like-minded candidates around the country and has said his immediate goal is to influence this year's elections. In Sarasota, Florida, where he lives, he has worked in concert with members of the extremist group, the Proud Boys, to influence local politics. Their favorite candidates in August won control of the county school board. His mantra, Flynn's mantra, is, quote, "Local action has a national impact." He told a crowd in Salt Lake City, quote, "We need to take this country back, one town at a time, one county at a time, one state at a time, if that's what it takes," end quote. Flynn's advocacy of lies and conspiracy theories hardly makes him unique in a fact-challenged America, but his pedigree, military career, and high-powered Washington contacts set him apart. He's a retired three-star general who, less than 2 decades ago, developed wartime strategies for countering insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan. His selection as Trump's first national security advisor made him the ultimate insider, giving him nominal control, if only for a matter of weeks, of the administration's national security strategy. When he later found himself in legal trouble on suspicion that he had lied to the FBI about his conversations with the Russian ambassador to the United States, he cooperated with the same government establishment that he now crusades against. In the weeks after the November 2020 presidential election, Flynn picked up a presidential pardon, granted to forgive his guilty plea of lying to the FBI. He immediately became a chief promoter of the Stop the Steal effort and championed bogus claims about foreign interference and ballot tampering that weren't supported by credible evidence. For some voters, Flynn's status as a retired general and top intelligence officer gave weight to the empty theories. He falsely said Trump won, called the election outcome part of a, quote, coup in progress, end quote. He suggested Trump should seize voting machines. He said Trump could order up the military in some states and rerun the election. In December 2020, he even made his way into the Oval Office to push his ideas directly to Trump. Called before a congressional committee investigating the Capitol insurrection of January 6, 2021, Flynn refused to say whether he believed the violence was justified or even whether he believed in the peaceful transition of power. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right repeatedly not to incriminate himself. Retired Brigadier General Stephen Anderson, who served with Flynn in Iraq, calls Flynn's ideas antithetical to core values of the American military and the nation itself. Anderson worries that Flynn, quote, is a role model for thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers and former soldiers, end quote, and that his ideas can empower them to take actions that hurt the country. Anderson said, quote, "We've got a retired three-star former NSA who says he can overthrow the election, use our military. Well, then, yes, the thinking goes, sign me up for the Proud Boys," end quote. Flynn uses the 3 stars he earned in the military as his symbol, a shorthand that reminds people he came from the highest levels of the nation's power structure. And that suggests he has a special knowledge of how things work in the shadowy world of Washington and global affairs. Endorsing, the general, who described his former colleague as, quote, a subservient buffoon that unfortunately has forsaken his oath of office, added, quote, it's a crying shame that essentially has evolved into the person he is now, end quote. Doug Weiss, a former CIA and military officer who knew Flynn for decades and briefly served as Flynn's deputy at the Defense Intelligence Agency, said even in the military, Flynn often pushed the envelope of what was permissible and demonstrated so-called extreme thinking. Doug Weiss believes Flynn hasn't transformed. He's just become more comfortable acting on the anger that burns inside him. Weiss said, quote, I understand the reason why he gravitated to the right wing because as his behavior and beliefs became more bizarre, I think they were very welcoming. Because who wouldn't want a highly respected Army 3-star to join your group? Weiss added, quote, I think he believed post-government, and he was right in this, that he was too well connected to fail. And he got pardoned, end quote. Flynn sees conspiracies in just about every corner of American life. He repeated lies about Black Lives Matter and said that so-called globalists created COVID-19. He tells the tens of thousands of people who have paid to see him speak that there are 75 members of the Socialist Party in Congress. And he has said the left and Democrats are trying to destroy the country. He asserts, above all else, that the United States was founded on Christian values. The bedrock, he warns, is crumbling. The country, Flynn often says in speeches and interviews, is in the midst of a spiritual war. And he goes after many of the institutions and ideas that stand as pillars of American democracy. He has told audiences he doesn't trust the U.S. government or government institutions that oversee the rule of law. He called the media the number one enemy and said it has done, quote, a horrible, horrible disservice to the country by just constantly lying and trying to deceive us, end quote. He says elementary schools are teaching filth and pornography. He continues to assert, ignoring all evidence to the contrary, that elections can't be trusted. He says over and over that some of his fellow Americans are, his word, evil. He told a podcaster recently, quote, they dress like us and they talk like us, but they don't think and act like us. And they definitely do not want what it is that we want, end quote. Survey data shows many Americans believe what Flynn says, that the 2020 election was stolen, and have bought into COVID-19 misinformation and other conspiracy theories that he spreads. Like a person named Kristen Dumez, a professor of history at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who studies the evangelical movement. This is what she said, quote, any of these factors alone would be considered dangerous. But all of them together and the distrust it is sowing in our democracy, I think it's extremely dangerous in this moment, end quote. Ms. Dumez points to Flynn's role as headliner of a multiplicity roadshow known as the Reawaken America Tour, an event that is a potent mix of politics, religion, and commerce that has become a prime example of the Christian nationalist movement. Flynn helped found the tour in 2021 with Clay Clark, an entrepreneur from Oklahoma, who had been running business conferences before the pandemic. In his interview with the AP and Frontline in February, Flynn said he considered himself, quote, a senior leader, end quote, of the team that's running it. The thread of Christian nationalism runs through many of Flynn's events. At one fundraiser, a preacher prayed over him, saying that America would stay a Christian nation and that Flynn was, quote, heavy armaments, end quote, in the Lord's quiver. At the Christian Patriots rally, so-called, at a church in Northern California, Flynn was presented with an assault-style rifle on stage. In Virginia in July, he said pastors, quote, need to be talking about the Constitution from the pulpit as much as the Bible, end quote. In Texas last November, Flynn told a crowd, quote, this is a moment in time where this is good versus evil. If we are going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion. One nation under God and one religion under God, right? End quote. Christian nationalism seeks to merge the identity of Christians and Americans so that to be a true American is to be a Christian and a certain type of Christian. The ideology pushes the idea that the United States was founded on biblical principles and has a favored relationship with a Christian God. That's according to Sam Perry, a sociologist, University of Oklahoma, who studies conservative Christianity and politics. It is distinct from the practice of Christianity. And Perry's research has found that many Americans who are inclined toward Christian nationalism don't go to church. Perry said, quote, this has nothing to do with Christian orthodoxy. It has nothing to do with loving Jesus or waiting or wanting to be a good disciple or loving your neighbor or self-sacrifice or anything like that. It has everything to do with Christian ethnoculture and specifically white Christian ethnoculture. Flynn casts himself as a victim of the deep state, who paid a steep price for supporting Trump. Besides Trump, his supporters say, no one has been persecuted more than Flynn. Flynn's rhetoric, us versus them, good versus evil, the idea that God is on our side, has been a staple among conservative Christians for decades and is mainstream in conservative evangelicalism, according to Professor Demez. The thinking, she said, can fuel violence. Demez says the thinking goes, quote, they're out to get us, therefore we need to strike first. And the threat is always dire. And if the threat is dire, then the ends justify the means. End quote. Professor Demez added, quote, these values are not unconnected from the violence that we saw on January 6. End quote. When the AP and Frontline asked Flynn in February if he ascribes to Christian nationalist views, he dodged the question. He first asked what the term meant. Then he said he was, quote, an Irish Catholic. And then he said, quote, a follower of Jesus, before he started criticizing the reporter. He said, quote, that was a stupid question to ask me because that means that you really have not studied Mike Flynn, end quote. Last October, Flynn was the star attraction at the We Can Act Liberty Conference, a gathering in Salt Lake City for Utah's Platform Republicans Political Action Committee. That program included dozens of speakers and exhibitors talking about a grab bag of ideas and causes that have seized and panicked the right wing, about vaccines and human trafficking and elections and the QAnon conspiracy theory. Among the sponsors and exhibitors were the John Birch Society and businesses selling everything from texting services for political campaigns to food dehydrators. Amnon Bundy's anti-government People's Rights Group was there, and America's Frontline Doctors, which has spread false information about COVID-19 and promoted unproven treatments such as ivermectin, a drug used to treat parasitic infections. State lawmakers from Arizona and Utah spoke, and members of the Utah Republican Party's governing committee were among the organizers. The program kicked off with an invocation by a preacher who brought the crowd to its feet as the preacher described what he called a prophecy of a great awakening where Americans are going to rise up and defeat the cabal. This preacher added, quote, "We are in a spiritual war, and you can't win a war without attacking," end quote. The preacher ended by leading the crowd in what he called, quote, "a new version of the Lord's Prayer that fits the Great Awakening," end quote. The crowd repeated after him as he said, quote, "Deliver us from the cabal and from Satan's influence, for yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever and ever. Amen," end quote. Flynn appeared a few times throughout the day, at one point sitting in the audience. Across the Salt Palace Convention Center, people jostled their seatmates to point him out and craned their necks to see him. That evening, he gave a meandering speech that he referred to as, quote, "an ass chewing from a general," end quote. He falsely declared once again that Trump had won the 2020 election, and he said, quote, "Our government is corrupt," and he called for the FBI to be abolished, a surprising applause line in October 2021 that is now taken up more broadly by some Republicans. He called the left, quote, "our enemies," and said they are, quote, "godless and soulless," end quote. One of Flynn's companies, Resilient Patriot LLC, was paid $58,000 by the conference. An AP and Frontline review of state and federal campaign finance filings documented nearly $300,000 in payments to Flynn and his businesses from candidates and political action committees since 2021 for things such as speaking fees, travel, book sales, and campaign consulting. For example, Florida congressional candidate Laura Loomer reportedly paid his company $1,100 in May for public relations services. After Flynn's keynote concluded, a podcaster helping to wrap things up for the evening came on stage and called him, quote, "one of the new founding fathers of this republic." As Flynn speaks and stumps to persuade people to join his movement, he also has been busy building a network of political candidates at the federal, state, and local levels. The AP and Frontline found that Flynn has endorsed 99 candidates for the 2022 election cycle. The country's most influential Republican is paying attention. Flynn's brother Joseph told an interviewer in May that during a visit to the Flynn's made to Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate this spring, Trump himself produced a list of companies, the success of his endorsed candidates. Trump produced a list comparing the success of his endorsed candidates with Flynn's. At least 80% of Flynn's chosen candidates have publicly spread lies or sown doubt about Trump's loss to Joe Biden, or even participated in efforts to overturn the election, so the AP and Frontline found. Several have suggested they would use their power, if elected, to change the way elections are run and how people are allowed to cast their vote. All right, let me pause there. There's more here, but that last sentence ties into something else I hope I have time to share with you on this podcast. Let me see where to pick it up. All right, let me start here. I think a couple of these sentences I already said during the last segment, but here we go. As Flynn speaks and stumps to persuade people to join his movement, he also has been busy building a network of political candidates at the federal, state, and local level. The AP and Frontline found that Flynn has endorsed 99 candidates for the 2022 election cycle. The country's most influential Republican is paying attention. Flynn's brother Joseph told an interviewer in May that during a visit the Flynn's made to Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate this spring, Trump himself produced a list comparing the success of his endorsed candidates with Flynn's. At least 80% of Flynn's chosen candidates have publicly spread lies or sown doubt about Trump's loss to Joe Biden, or even participated in efforts to overturn the election, according to the AP and Frontline. Several have suggested they would use their power, if elected, to change the way elections are run and how people are allowed to cast their vote. About 24 were at the U.S. Capitol during the riot. 1/3 have served in the military. Now, let me pause for a second and mention again, before I forget, my sponsor tonight is Jim Schuckman. Once again, thank you, Jim. Jim is a frequent sponsor, and I think he's sponsoring tomorrow night, too, Friday night. But his message is what it always is. Everyone should support the Mike Malloy podcast and exercise every day. Amen to both. Thank you, Jim Schuckman. Thank you, Jim, very, very much. All right, back to this horror story. At least 38 of the people Flynn have endorsed are using Christian nationalist rhetoric. Keith Self, a congressional candidate in Texas, has said he's running for Congress, quote, to defend the Christian foundations of this nation, end quote. Christine Villaverde, a congressional candidate in North Carolina, has vowed to fight to keep America, quote, a Christian nation. Anthony Sabatini, a Florida state lawmaker who just lost a bid for Congress, recently boasted on Facebook, quote, only when Christians stand up and get loud will we take this country back. Flynn's support can be a sought-after prize. An AP and Frontline analysis of Facebook and Instagram ad data found ads from more than 20 candidates promoting their endorsements. Jason Lohmeyer, an Oklahoma pastor who was defeated in the Republican primary for U.S. Senate by Senator James Lankford, mentioned Flynn in 48 Facebook and Instagram ads, more than 1/4 of his total buy on those two platforms. Pastor Leon Benjamin, a Republican candidate for Congress in Virginia, who denounced homosexuality and called gay marriage illegal in an August speech, said in an interview that Flynn's endorsement represents, quote, that affirmation and that understanding that we've got to have the right candidates in, and it's not always popular, not always goes along with the grain. If we keep doing the same things over and over again, that's the definition of insanity. So we've got to do something different to get different results, end quote. More than 40 of Flynn's 99 endorsements were for candidates seeking state or even local posts, the AP and Frontline found. Flynn endorsed 2 school board contenders in Camdenton, Missouri, candidates for sheriff in Florida, Nevada, and Illinois, and a city council candidate in North Carolina. He endorsed candidates for the state legislature in Michigan, Ohio, Arizona, Florida, Texas, and Missouri. In Arizona, Michigan, California, and Colorado, he gave his approval to candidates for Secretary of State, a position that typically involves the administration of elections. A dozen gubernatorial candidates won Flynn's backing, including Pennsylvania's Republican nominee Doug Mastriano, a state lawmaker whom Flynn introduced at his campaign launch. Mastriano, a retired U.S. Army colonel, floated a plan to undo Biden's victory in his state. He organized buses to the U.S. Capitol for January 6, and he was filmed walking past barricades and police lines that day. Mastriano has denied breaking the law and has not been charged with any crimes. Another Flynn endorsee, Dan Cox, who also organized buses for January 6, won the Republican gubernatorial nomination in Maryland. Still, Flynn's endorsement doesn't guarantee a win. Josh Mandel, the Ohio U.S. Senate candidate, was defeated by J.D. Vance, who got a late endorsement from Trump. Some Flynn-backed candidates, including gubernatorial candidate Joy Gilbert in Nevada and Colorado Secretary of State candidate Tina Peters, made baseless claims of election fraud after they lost. Flynn and his allies have suggested he wants to get back into government, and by growing influence that flows from the network he's building may help him get there. That's according to Ron Filipkowski, a lawyer in Sarasota and longtime Republican activist who now tracks Flynn and other far-right figures online. Filipkowski said, quote, he's going to build this grassroots movement, local elected officials beholden to him, loyal to him. End quote. Flynn has expanded his influence further through well-financed groups that advocate, among other things, changes to the way elections are run, based on the false premise that there is widespread voting fraud. Flynn and Patrick Byrne, the founder of Overstock.com, last year launched the America Project, with Flynn's brother Joseph as president. The group said it planned to spend $50 million in the 2021 budget year, according to a filing with North Carolina charity regulators. But Joseph Flynn and Byrne separately told the Associated Press that it had spent tens of millions of dollars less, though each gave different totals. While Flynn himself is not listed among its officers, he's the face of the group and is described as, quote, General Flynn and Patrick Byrne's America Project, end quote. Burns says Flynn is his closest advisor, telling the AP and Frontline that Flynn is his Yoda and his rabbi. In April 2021, Flynn was named chairman of America's Future, one of the country's oldest conservative nonprofits. The organization was founded in 1946 and was previously led by ultra-conservative stalwarts, including Phyllis Schlafly and retired Major General John Singlaub. Since Flynn took over, the group hired his sister, Mary O'Neill, as executive director and appointed Joseph Flynn to its board of directors. The group has about $3 million in assets at the end of 2020. Its most recent IRS filings show. Flynn told the AP and Frontline in February that he had raised an estimated $1.7 million for America's Future since becoming chairman. The two groups worked in close coordination last year, together donating more than $4.2 million for a widely criticized and misinformation-driven review of the 2020 presidential election results that was commissioned by Arizona Republicans. The America Project has given about $5 million to so-called grassroots organizations around the country, according to Joseph Flynn, in a July appearance on an online show. Many of the groups they support back what they call, quote, election integrity, end quote, a term often used by election deniers to justify making it more difficult to vote based on the lie that American elections are corrupt. Campaign finance records show that the America Project has given more than $150,000 to Conservatives for Election Integrity. That's a group that has supported several Secretary of State candidates who have worked to undermine trust in 2020 election results. The America Project gave $100,000 to a Colorado group titled Citizens for Election Integrity, which used it for ads and text messages attacking a Republican candidate for Secretary of State who ran against Flynn's endorsed candidate. In Michigan, the America Project gave $100,000 in May to an organization called Secure Michigan Vote, which has pushed to roll back voter access. And in Georgia, they announced that they're backing an effort to challenge voter registrations for tens of thousands of people. Joseph Flynn said during a speech in May that the America Project also funded and advised many of what he termed audits of elections around the country, including in Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin, though he didn't give specifics. In February, Flynn stood in a burger joint in Orlando, Florida, to announce the America Project's most public initiative entitled Operation Eagle's Wings, the goal of which is to mobilize and train poll watchers and precinct captains and to drive get-out-the-vote efforts. Flynn told the AP and Frontline during that contentious interview, quote, I think every single person in this country, every American citizen now has to pay attention to politics. You know, when people do, or when people go, I don't get involved, I don't do that political stuff, that's for the politicians. Well, that's exactly why we are here, okay? So it's something else that you don't write or speak about, or it'll be edited out, end quote. As part of Operation Eagle's Wings, the America Project has created affiliate groups in at least 9 states. Its Florida affiliate said in a Facebook post last month that it's seeking, quote, America First poll watchers, end quote, and will train organizations for free. State affiliates in Illinois and Virginia advertised training in July and August on grassroots social activism, poll watching, and how to get out the vote. The promotions also promised to teach attendees to, quote, expose weaknesses, monitor and evaluate absentee voting, and conduct investigative canvassing, end quote. The initiative has raised alarm bells with pro-democracy advocates. Jacek Pruski of the nonpartisan group Protect Democracy said, quote, if people who try to overturn the 2020 election or who are fueled by election conspiracies, if they're trying to recruit their followers or allies to be election workers or volunteers as part of an election denial agenda, that poses real risks to fair and free elections. With his speeches, endorsements, and outreach groups, Flynn has built a legion of acolytes who are listening closely to what he says and are ready to take action. They include Karen Balish, who is vice chair of the Summit County Republican Party in Utah, who heard Flynn speak in Salt Lake City. She said, quote, I totally believe in his message. We have to be the ones who make the change. If we don't do it, we won't have a country, end quote. His followers include neophytes like Delana Prettyman, who said she's become politically engaged in the past year. She said, quote, that sent me deep down a rabbit hole. I don't watch any news, any TV, anything, and I do a ton of research, end quote. She came to love Flynn, she says, and she believes, quote, everything he says. He's got a lot of intel and insight about everything that's going on. Of course, he can't say everything. We need more people like General Flynn, end quote. Back under that tent in Batavia, New York, the crowd thrilled to Flynn's pronouncements from the stage. The general they claim as their own confirmed their feelings that the U.S. is changing and not for the better. He validated the belief that the community they have built together is under attack. They know many people, some of their very own friends and loved ones, and even Biden, say they are a destructive force. But inside the tent, Flynn assured them they have found their tribe and they are in the right. Flynn said, quote, we're not alone in this is what I'm telling you, okay? We're not alone in what it is that we are doing. We are not alone. I want you to know that, end quote. Whoosh. All right. The longest thing I think I've ever read on a podcast, or for that matter, on anything I've done in radio. But there's, and remember, it is scheduled to be broadcast on PBS on October 18th. It'll also be online if you don't, want or use or have a television. It'll be online. So don't miss it. All right? Seriously, don't miss it. My God. And all through this article, and I'm sure it'll be on the Frontline case, they refer to it as Christian nationalism. And it is more appropriately called Christian terrorism, which is exactly what it is. And as this article tried to point out, rather weakly, I think, but as it tried to point out, these people are not really the kinds of Christians that you and I were brought up to believe defined the term Christian. These people are terrorists. They are determined to destroy the country. They want to live under a dictatorship, and they want that dictatorship to be here. Oh, my God. Does it ever stop? I don't think it does. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.